right, everyone, welcome to episode 55 of Handischlapped. I am your host, the Reverend Jordan Schrader, and today we're going to do something a little different again. We're going to have a discussion on writing and storytelling, particularly what it means to go through Christian storytelling, and there's so much layers to talk about that. And to do so, we're going to be talking with an old friend of mine. He goes by Ben Wolf. He's a multi-award winning author of books and children's books and nonfiction books. He's also a ghostwriter and speaker. He's written about 20 books now, including Blood for Blood, The Crimson Flame, and The Ghost Mine. And I punch a lion in the eye for you. So he's done many great things, and I've known him for many, many years now when I was growing up. Ben, welcome to Handischlapped. How are you doing?
Doing really well, Jordan. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. And we've known each other for a long time. How did we first meet again?
We met at Vineyard Community Church in Grafton, Wisconsin, which is a northern suburb of Milwaukee. And I was just attending the church, and then they later, we can say the word hired, although it was a little bit more informal than that. They hired me on as the youth pastor, where I served for a couple of years doing that before transitioning full time into writing and publishing type stuff. And so you were going to the same church as me. You were in the youth group, out of the youth group, helping with the youth group. It was a wide range of our interactions over the course of the years. And then fortunately, we've been able to stay in touch all this time too.
Yeah, praise God for that. And
Amen.
when I met you at youth group and I was growing up and helping out and everything, you were talking with me just a lot about when you were growing up as well, because we had very similar tastes and ideas of wanting to become writers. And I think over time we talked about how when you were writing books growing up and you actually became an author, how that influenced me and inspired me in my own drive to write movies and to make
Yeah.
movies as a writer and film director. And that just inspired me so much. And the way you talk to me about writing, it seems like you had that desire and that flame from such an early age. Like you were talking to me about how I believe you wrote, it was either just a story or it was a full-on book at the age of 18, if I'm remembering correctly,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
It did end up being a complete book. My senior year in high school, when I was 17, I started in independent study to write a novel. And I thought, well, this is something that I've always wanted to do. And I have an open hour in my day. It was first period every day for the entire school year. Went in and hung out with my creative writing teacher because she had first hour free as well. So it was just me and her, and I was in one corner. She was at her desk working on stuff, and I was at a separate little desk kind of in the opposite corner, and I was working on writing a book. I really had no idea what I was doing. I just knew, well, this is kind of a fun story in my head, and let's see how much of it I can get onto paper. I didn't end up finishing the book throughout the course of the year, but I did finish it a couple years later while I was in college. And so that was the first real book, with big air quotes here. That was the first real book that I attempted to write. I did eventually finish it. It ended up being 167,000 words long, which is way too long for a first book for most genres anyway. But then thanks to my first writers conference, which I went to in 2009, I learned how to reshape it and make it better. And I literally cut the book in half. So it ended up being 83,500 words, which is half of 167,000. And it was a much tighter paced, much cleaner, much more professionally done product. But even so, I still haven't published it because for a lot of us authors, your first book is always kind of going to be a heaping pile of garbage, and I am not an exception to that. It's just not very good. So that one is going to stay in a drawer, and I probably won't ever publish it. But it was a good learning experience for me. So that's the backstory behind the writing a book at 17 or 18 years old.
What like why did you want to write at such a young age?
I think you could probably relate to this, Jordan.
Hmm.
I have story ideas in my head and they won't leave me alone. And that's been going on for since middle school. Honestly, the my
Hmm.
awakening, if you want to call it that, to writing was to doing the writing myself. I was always a big reader, but my awakening to doing the writing came in middle school when I saw the movie Congo. And this is all over a lot of my bios in my books and on my website and stuff. But I saw the movie Congo and it was so bad that I decided to write a parody of it featuring killer kangaroos instead of gorillas and set in Australia instead of Africa. And so, naturally, being in seventh grade, I named it Congo Roo because that's what you do when you're a seventh grader and you're a spoof of something. So that's really what kind of ignited something within me to actually sit down and do the writing. And so the outflow from that um, was eventually the independent study that I did my senior year because I wanted to
Hmm.
something more serious because obviously that was goofy and fun and rambling and didn't always make a lot of sense, but it was seventh, eighth grade humor as opposed to the very sophisticated humor of a high school senior. So that's sort of the genesis of my writing inspiration, and from then on, like I can't turn the spigot off. It just keeps I keep getting ideas. I keep having to decide, well, am I going to write this one or am I going to write that one? Am I going to ignore this idea forever or what? So it's for me, it's just a constant flow of ideas, and uh, it's a blessing. It's a blessing and a little bit of a curse, but it's more of a blessing for sure.
Yeah, yeah, right on, man. That's hilarious. Did you ever read the book version of Congo?
I did not. No, I the movie turned me off so much that I was just like, well, no thanks. But I did read several other Michael Crichton books. I read Timeline. I read Jurassic Park and Lost World. There might have been a couple other ones scattered throughout as well. I really liked Michael Crichton as an author.
Awesome. I read when I was in middle school, I think I started reading Jurassic Park as well, but that was so long ago.
Yeah.
But like, so you talk about Michael Crichton, you talk about all these different genres you like. You and I have had conversations. We both love video games. We both love sci-fi. We both love horror, fantasy. You have a very eclectic taste. And then at the same time, you have a you have a noticeable, I should say, emphasis on universal, specifically Christian themes in
Mhm.
some of your writing. And why Christian writing, I should say, or is that the wrong terminology to say that I'm a Christian author when you tell people, or what's a better way to say that?
This is a really interesting discussion because and it's one that I've been involved in on various levels throughout the years because that it's a solid question. What is a Christian author? Is it merely an author who is a Christian who writes, or is it
Hmm.
specifically a, an author who writes Christian books or some
Hmm.
hybrid of the two, or is there any gray area in between? And so for me, when when I'm talking to people, because my I find my identity in Christ, I am a Christian first and foremost, a little Christ, a follower of Christ, in the truest and traditional sense of the word, not in the American capitalist version of the word, the over industrialized version of the word. And so, labeling myself as a Christian, that's sort of just who I am as a person. An author, being an author, is an outflow of the gifts that I have been given and the gifts, perhaps even more importantly, that I have cultivated, a la the parable of the talents. Uh, and so to call myself a Christian author, I think the understanding of putting those two words right next to each other would imply that I write specifically Christian books. But that's not
Hmm.
really the case. I have two books. Looking back at my bookshelf, I think I have 2 books that are more explicitly Christian, and the rest of them, like you said, entertain some Christian themes that are universal in a lot of ways. But for the most part, I don't identify as a Christian author because I think the moniker doesn't fit. A lot of what I write
Right.
is, yeah, it's, especially
Hmm.
with the sci-fi horror, you mentioned to me that you're reading through the Ghost Mine right now. Doesn't really
Hmm.
feel like a Christian book, does it? And that's
No.
because it's not. With that said, I did manage to sneak some Bible verses in there because that's a part of who I am, and so it's an
Hmm.
outflow of who I am as a person. That's natural in anything that we do that's creative. Whatever we create, excuse me, whatever we create does reflect who we are as people. And so on that level, I am a Christian author, but the label, the way it's used publicly, doesn't apply to me based on the definition that the world would put on that terminology. Does
Hmm.
that make sense to you? You
Yeah,
follow
it
what I'm saying?
does. And like when I was growing up for me, like you and I grew up, albeit different levels, um, during the 90s and early 2000s. And you see a really interesting dynamic shift there in not just Christian writing, but writers who are just so happen to be Christian or authors or artists becoming more mainstream or embedded into the pop culture. Especially in
Yep.
the 90s, we see in music, you see got like John Cooper with Skillet, or
Mhm.
for children, you see Veggie Tales. For adults,
Yeah.
you see the Left Behind books. How all three
Mhm.
of those blew up in the pop
Mhm.
culture. Why do you think things like that at that time, if that's relevant, the time that is, why did like things like that become so big and known in pop culture collective consciousness?
I think there's probably a lot of reasons for it, and I think some of the reasons are specific to each of those three scenarios that you presented. There wasn't, and let's take VeggieTales as an example. That's a really poignant example of what you're talking about. There
Mhm.
wasn't really, from what I remember, a lot of high-end Christian children's entertainment. Sure, there were the occasional cartoons. I will say Adventures in Odyssey was pretty solid.
Yes.
So
Oh,
three cheers
yes.
to Adventures in Odyssey because they've been at it for a long time and they do good work. But aside from them, there wasn't anything that was really grabbing kids our age when we were that age, uh, and teaching them lessons in a fun, entertaining, and humorous way.
Mhm.
I was very blessed in children's church growing up. I had a series of really fantastic children's pastors. Really, like, I don't think I could have ended up with a better slate of children's pastors. These were folks who loved Jesus, loved the kids that they were uh, teaching about Jesus, and they loved their
Mhm.
jobs too. And they were all incredibly talented and really put on great. It was like a show almost every week, and almost every weekend at church these children's pastors would really do a fantastic job of bringing the stories to life in interested and creative ways. And it went beyond just, oh, we're going to do a puppet show, or, oh, we're going to do a skit. No, they like poured their heart and souls into these things. And I know that because later on in my life, I got to help write and act in some of the things that we would do on Sunday mornings. And I got to help out with that. So all that to circle back to VeggieTales, the production value of VeggieTales, and obviously what got better as it went on. We hadn't seen anything aside from Adventures in Odyssey with the production value of VeggieTales until VeggieTales came along. It
Mhm.
was a unique and weird idea. Like, we're going to learn about the kingdom of God from vegetables. Okay, sure,
Mhm.
I'll go with it. And also in that case, I do think the fact that they were computer generated instead of animated, like Adventures in Odyssey, I do think that that played into their favor because at the time that technology was relatively new. We
Mhm.
had Toy Story, and then VeggieTales came out not long after that. Either it might have even come out before. I don't know the exact timeline, but
I think it was 1993 they dropped the first video.
there you go. And I don't remember what year the first Toy Story came out. VeggieTales may have preceded it, but either way,
Mhm.
it was new and interesting technology to create that artwork. And so that also, I think, was captivating to kids because it's like, oh, we haven't seen this before. And then for whatever
Mm,
reason, it caught on. So I think with any, and Left Behind is another good example of this, and then Skillet is another good example. With any type of media that is Christian in nature, it has to be really, 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 really good in order to catch on. It has to be well done, of the highest quality, and like whatever art form it is, it has to be like legit. You can't
mhm.
fake it. And unfortunately, and this is a whole nother rabbit trail that maybe we don't want to go down, but unfortunately, a lot of Christian creatives have the erroneous idea that, well, if I just create something, then God will take care of the rest, and we can, he'll market it and he'll make it sell. Like, I have faith that God will make it sell. And that's wrong. You have to do great work. Otherwise, the very human people of this world will not respect what you've done, and then they won't buy it, they won't support you. So you have to have really excellent quality. God's not going to do that work for you, because you're selling yourself short, you're selling the message short. You're not learning how to do any sort of marketing, you're not doing any of the work to put your work out there. I have got an entire blog post about it. I don't want to suck up too much of our time here lambasting all of these Christian creatives who don't do the work. So if you want to read more about it, go to my website, benwolf.com, and look up the blog. You'll get my ramblings there.
Thank you. That's really interesting to me because, like, what was it that broke the Christian audience barrier for those type of authors and artists? Like, how was it able to captivate so many beyond the Christians and make such an impact in a general audience?
For Left Behind is probably the one that I know the most about, being in publishing and with that being a book series,
Hmm.
and having had conversations with Jerry B. Jenkins, who's one of the two co-authors of the series.
Hmm.
Um, my understanding of how that played out was that it was kind of the perfect storm of everything hitting the right way. And most certainly, Left Behind started out hitting it big with Christian audiences. And then it did something that rarely happens with Christian books. It went above and beyond and reached a general market audience too. And I think the reason that it reached a general market audience, there were a lot of them, of course, but I think the political climate of the day, especially with a lot of the troubles in the Middle East, because I believe the first book launched either in the very early 2000s or the late 90s. Israel and Palestine were really butting heads for a long time there. And for most of that time, we were getting constant news reports about it. And then very, very shortly after George Bush took office, we had 9/11, which was horrible, of course. And then we very quickly got into the war with Iraq. So we had the Persian Gulf War, and then we waited a few years, and then Left Behind comes out somewhere in the middle, and then 9/11 happens, and it just kept growing and growing and growing. So I think being sandwiched between two wars with Iraq helped, that and the content of the books, with it being end times, with a lot of it taking place in the Middle East. I think that those were a couple of factors that played into it. And then I also think Tim LaHaye had a pretty big following, and Jerry B. Jenkins had a decent sized following as well at the time, before they actually started launching the books. And then when the first book took off, I mean, that's just, you get carte blanche from your publisher at that point to just keep going. So I think it was really the combination of a lot of different advantages and timing of things that hit at the right time for the series, politically, socially, economically.
Yeah.
It all just convalesced into the right mix of stuff for it to
Yeah.
do really well.
Yeah, I see that in a cycle as well. 'Cause in the 70s, there's also kind of a rise in end times content. Like when I was a little kid, I remember watching like TBN and stuff, like a lot of end times movies, rapture movies, and all that stuff from the 70s. And then we see another resurgence in the late 90s. And it's just amazing how all those factors can be reflected in film or media or books, and how it all like is so reflective of each other. I always thought that was interesting. I think that's really true what you say about like the political climate, and it really was the perfect storm. It was weird at the time.
Yeah,
Everything was weird. And
everything was, yeah.
so like what changed since then? By the way, I'm gonna do a timeout right here. Don't worry about the timer if you see it. There's a
Yeah,
timer on my end. Ignore that. It'll cut us off. We'll just start over, and then I'll just put the edits together.
sure, that works. That's kind of what I thought you were going to do, but that's fine. So we'll try to end on it, you know, without getting cut off. So
Yeah,
that way
exactly.
I'll
Okay.
try to finish thoughts. Yeah.
All
So
right.
what was your question?
So just time myself. Three, two, one. All right. So everything was kind of weird at the time, and how everything came together to
Yeah.
boost these content, this Christian content into the mainstream. People were eating it up like candy, because they wanted that. And
Hmm.
the content was so good at the time as well to bring the general market into it. And after that, it kind of changed. Like the quality seemed to drop, the relevance and the demand for it in the general market sense seemed to drop, and it kind of went totally opposite, and it became very negative. And what do you think changed? Because nowadays, 20 years later, we got the Pure Flix movies, or the God's Not Dead movies, and 20 years ago it would have been a different story, but today, while they're loved by Christian audiences for the most part, general audiences seem to um, popularize those in the sense of bashing it, giving it negative reviews, negative comments, calling it too preachy, etc. And nowadays, I can kind of see what you're talking about, how Christian media, books, film, whatever, has kind of gone the more
Yeah.
preachy route and upfront. What do you think changed? I suppose is my question.
I think a lot of things changed. I think that the overwhelming success of things like Left Behind, a lot of Frank Peretti's books did really well during that time frame too. And then Jeanette Oak was the sort of the softer side of things. She sold tons and tons of books. Debbie Macomber is another one on the more romance side of things. Um, because of the overwhelming success of some of these authors during that time frame, I think that the pendulum slid real far in one direction, right? With the Christian authors
Mhm.
are killing it, right? Or at least a select few were killing it. And then Ted Decker was another one who was doing really well. Since then, and you know this as much as I do, as much as any Christian of our age or older, uh, society has really changed.
Mhm.
We have the pendulum on society has swung in a very different direction in terms of a lot of the ideologies of the day. They're not, they don't align with Christianity in certain ways very well. And it could be argued that they align with Christianity better in some ways, but that's not the content of this conversation. The
Mhm.
fact is, the ideologies have changed, and certain ideologies have been adopted more widespread in our culture. And so with that, a lot of the stuff that was cool or interesting or appropriate in the late 90s, early 2000s just doesn't fly these days. So you mentioned the preachiness. preachy aspect of some of the media from back then, especially the Christian stuff. You really, even the Christian readers don't want you to be preachy in their books these days, the majority of them. The preachiness idea of it has been out the door and out the window since at least 2009, which is when I was really coming up and starting. Like, even people were even talking about it then at my first writers conference. Oh, we don't want anything preachy.
Right. So what do you mean by preachy, or what do they mean by preachy? I feel like that can go multiple ways.
You're right, it can. One of the big hallmarks of having a preachy book is if you include an actual conversion scene. So a scene where a character accepts Christ into their heart and becomes a Christian and makes that profession of faith. That's considered to be very, very preachy. And that was one of the obstacles I had to deal with. I don't have a copy handy when I was writing Blood for Blood, my What If a Vampire Got Saved novel, because it's like central to the story. There is no story unless the vampire becomes a Christian. So having to deal with that and trying to sell that to a traditional publisher was pretty much a non-starter, because they couldn't get past the fact that it was vampires, which Christians don't read apparently, which is not true. And the fact that there was a conversion scene. So that's one of them. The other one is just, if your characters are too good or too well behaved, or if they're all constantly telling other characters how to live their lives, and if the characters who are doing the telling are the good guys in the story, then it comes across as preachy, as opposed to authentic and real, and people with struggles who, yeah, I know for me, I don't always get my Christian faith correct. I'm sure you're probably perfect in every single way.
Yeah.
But me, I'm a human, and it doesn't work out for me that way. So that's what readers of all stripes, whether they're Christian or non-Christian or anything in between, that's what they want to read about. They want to encounter characters who are realistic rather than perfect archetypes of what a Christian should be.
Like, are there certain ways of getting around it or saying, like, are there certain words that make it preachy and non-preachy? Like, okay, in your book, for example, you have a character that accepts Christ. That's a literal Christian conversion. But if you
Yeah.
do it in a more symbolic or um, metaphorical way or something like that, another literary trick of doing so, does that make a difference?
It does make a difference, in my opinion. One of the choices I made specifically in later revisions of Blood for Blood, the vampire novel, was to remove the character actually repeating the Lord's Prayer after the preacher was praying, because that's a very Christian thing. If you're a Christian, you've probably been to a number of services where at the end the pastor says, if you want to accept Christ, all you have to do is pray the words that I'm praying and mean it. And then you repeat it after the minister. That's great, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, nothing at all. But in a book, for me, it was coming across as too preachy. For some of my beta readers, it was coming across as too just like in your face preachy. So what I did instead is I used what's called narrative summary, and I had the basically the lines are something like, and then he led him in prayer, and then boom, and then the vampire says, that's it, that's all I have to do. Yep, that's it. And then so you get the story moving again. You get the conflict back into it, you get the tension back into it, you get the story on its feet and get it moving. So whatever, anytime you have to stop and explain something, or if you're having a preachy moment, you're essentially stopping the story and say, no, this is right and what you're doing is wrong. Readers don't want that, and what they want is for the story to continue. So as long as you are moving the story along, I think you're at less risk of ending up being preachy.
hmm So like this kind of comes to something I just think about all the time when I watch movies or if I'm writing a movie myself or just anything. Like it could be any kind of thing now. Like, is there a stigma or I want to say stigma, but is there a hold on. Is there like a stigma of you could say authors who use Christian literary devices or just I will say Christian authors of are they more censored? I use that in quotes, of course.
Sure, sure. I think I understand what you're asking. We can fire back and forth at each other for clarification as needed, but I think very much so in terms of the general market. The general market is less agreeable to books and stories that use some of those Christian plot devices, which are so convenient for us in storytelling, to resolve the actual story that's being told. So, for example, you mentioned earlier God's Not Dead, the first movie.
Mhm.
They kill Kevin Sorbo off at the end. Spoiler alert, sorry. Um, they kill off Kevin Sorbo's character, and he is the atheist. But as he is dying in the result of being hit by a car or being in a car accident, there was a car involved somehow. I forget what it was.
He
As
gets
he's
hit, I
dying,
think, yeah.
yeah, in the rain, no less. He realizes, oh my gosh, I've been living my life wrong this whole time, and he accepts Christ and then he dies. Um, that that got panned by Christians and non-Christians alike because it was cheap storytelling. It was
Okay.
lousy. So something like that where you
Mhm.
force the outcome that you want because it fits your ideology, that's poor storytelling. And I don't think it's so much that people were reacting to, oh, he became a Christian. I don't like Christians. I think it was more that people reacting to, really, that's how you're going to end this story? You got to kill the atheist to convince him to be a Christian? It was the reaction to the poor storytelling more than it was to the ideology being preached. And then, of
Mhm.
course, the movie itself, apart from that, it was fine. It wasn't like an amazing movie for any other reason, really.
Mhm.
And so the overall the perception of the quality, it's if they hadn't ended it that way, the movie probably would have been just fine. But because they ended it that way, that was like the last thing that anyone remembers about that film because it happens right at the end. And so the lasting impression you got is, oh, so if I'm dying, I can just make a deathbed confession and
Right.
still get it. Is that really even the message that we as Christians want to be sending? It's a
Mhm.
huge conversation, Jordan. I could bloviate for hours on this, but suffice to say, like, to more directly answer your original question, yes, I do think there's censorship, but because we Christian creatives, have not been good stewards with the talents and the storytelling that we have. If we had told the stories the right way, like Left Behind very much did, like VeggieTales very much did, like Skillet very much does, if we had been telling stories and using our talents in a way that is effective and good, as opposed to trying to cheat our way through the end or
Mhm.
take shortcuts, then I think we would be more respected in the industry.
Mhm. Yeah, and I look at like so many things and authors like let's look at the 20th century. You have the two of the probably the biggest authors, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who are also
Yep.
friends, of course, and they're well known. But later on, they would be considered either a hardcore Christian or a hardcore Catholic, however you want to
Right.
look at that. And yet,
Right.
they're the biggest influencers of fantasy and philosophy of the 20th century. So,
Yep.
like, what do you think made that difference? But I mean, that's a whole like collegiate discussion right
True.
there that we could go on. But like, they were the biggest authors of the past probably 70 years, and
Yeah.
yet probably one of the biggest Christians in the public eye. Like, what made that difference?
in my opinion, the time frame in which they lived
Hmm.
helped. It did a lot to help them. If C.S. Lewis and Tolkien showed up now, I don't think they would be nearly as respected, despite how brilliant they both were. And I'm a fan of both. I'm not a ginormous fan of both, but I have incredible respect for what they did and what they gave us in terms of both creativity and just the philosophy and the great thinking that they put into all of their work. With all that said, they benefited from the time in which they were published. The time in which they published 70 years ago, again, we just had the conversation about the different ideologies that that are at play nowadays in our society as compared to even just 20 years ago when Left Behind was coming out, or VeggieTales or Skillet or some of these other big Christian blockbusters. Back then, the ideologies that are prevalent these days were not even really, they were they weren't even on the periphery. They weren't even on the fringest of fringes. They were
Hmm.
considered to be either bad or deviant or whatever word that you want to ascribe to them.
Hmm.
They were just so far out of the public mainstream that they didn't even rank. And so in the absence of some of those the stronger ideologies that are present today, we have they had the opportunity to be a little bit more vocal about their Christianity without the fear of mass media repercussions or social media repercussions or whatever.
Hmm.
And also that this society on the whole identified more directly as being Christian in more in the traditional sense, not in the American capitalistic sense. So I think it's really a historical benefit and a societal benefit that they had in terms of being able to write what they wrote, publish what they wrote, and develop a following and a legacy that continues to this day. That's my opinion
Hmm.
on it.
Yeah, and when you read Tolkien and Lewis, Tolkien, sorry, despised allegory. He was more his writing was more philosophically embedded into the actual storytelling and the motives and the dialogue of the
Right.
characters. It's almost like philosophical fiction. Like if you look at the books compared to the films. And then you look at C.S. Lewis, who really liked allegory. He liked to use symbols, like allegory is a story telling another story. And so his was a little more, um, you could say on the head, and it resonated so much with children with the Narnia series, which in fact is why he wrote Narnia, just so his kids could understand the Bible better. And so you got these two different ways of life that are trying to tell the same story of the Bible and Christianity as a whole. We got Tolkien, who went through World War One, and you see
Mhm.
that a lot with Lord of the Rings, is that reflection that the world was experiencing, especially Europe, as a parallel to Middle Earth, that reflection of what they went through and like Sam and Frodo being two soldiers making their way across the land. And then you got Lewis, on the other hand, who wanted to be more actual paralleling the Bible itself
Right.
rather than real world events. So I just always loved how they had such polar opposites in approach to that. And I think just the timing of the world, and especially with Lewis, how he was more post World War II
Mhm.
things. And you can just, I think this whole theme, I think it ties into with how like everything reflects the times,
Yes.
and you see that as well with like the biblical epic films of the 50s. And then you see exploitation films of the 70s, how just the culture changed from that post-World War II standardization and way of life. And then it flipped with the revolution, the cultural revolution. And you see all the up to today and how just the voices are changing. Different
Yep.
voices are being heard. I think that's what I love so much about just storytelling and um, all of that. And one of my favorite directors is Martin Scorsese, who, of course,
Mhm.
did Goodfellas, Casino, The Wolf of Wall Street, Cape Fear, Raging Bull, a very eclectic style of writing. And I think
Yep.
what I like about him, not just he's great, but I relate to him on a faith level. He was actually going to be a priest before he got into filmmaking. And what's interesting is that faith is very important to him in a certain way, his Catholic upbringing. So you have like these authors and storytellers that have religious roots, whether it's Christianity or whatever. And you see that in their films. Like you see a lot of it, obviously, much more so. He always wanted to do the controversial film, The Last Temptation of Christ.
Mhm.
And then years later, he made a movie called Silence, which is about um, Christian missionaries that go into Japan in the 16th century. And his other movies have Christian themes as well. But the general Christian would not notice that or think about that because, like, a lot of his movies are about gangster life in New York or excessive profanity or sexual content. And yet
Right.
he claims that Christianity, specifically his Catholic upbringing, is such a big influence on his storytelling. And I guess, I don't know if I really have a question, but more so your thoughts on that mindset, I guess.
I like the examples that you brought up, and with Scorsese, he's an interesting case study for sure, because you're exactly right. Looking at his stuff, watching his movies, your first thought wouldn't immediately be, oh, this guy's definitely a Christian. Quite the opposite, probably, for most viewers and
Mhm,
most of his audience. With that said, I totally relate to that, because that's kind of the stance that I take. Obviously, there's lines in my writing that I don't cross and won't cross, in terms of what I show or what I want to even include in the first place. But that doesn't mean that I won't go places that other Christians might be hesitant to go, whether as readers or writers. There's definitely, as you continue reading The Ghost Mine, you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about with this. But there are definitely some dark places in the world, and
mhm.
if we don't go there, who will? It's
Yeah.
going to be people in the general market who don't necessarily have a faith background, and their
Mhm,
perspective on the dark places of the world is going to be very different than our perspective, our Christian
mhm,
perspective. And to take it even a step further, my perspective as an individual, one person who is a Christian who has my life experiences, that perspective is still going to be different from any other Christian too. I'm going to look at how faith applies to my life or to my stories or to my work and on any level differently than my readers
mhm,
will. And no matter what I do, even if I'm being preachy with it, with which I certainly hope I'm not, even if I'm
mhm,
being preachy with it, it's never going to come across 100% the same way to a reader that I mean it to come across,
mhm,
because they've got their own worldview, they've got their own set of experiences, they've got their own beliefs, and so they're going to look at it through that specific lens too. And so
mhm.
now we're getting into the conversation of, how do you interpret art? And
Yep,
as a
exactly.
Christian, how do you interpret Christian art? Like, is where do you draw lines? How do you draw lines? And my stance with most of that is, give people freedom and let the Holy Spirit sort out the rest. From a Christian
hmm
perspective, honestly, I think that's the most biblical thing you can do
hmm
too, because if you don't trust the Holy Spirit to handle someone else's salvation, which is different than trusting God to do your marketing for you, totally different thing. If you present what you have and and you impact a certain person a certain way, what you're doing through that obedience is you're introducing them to thoughts and ideas that will eventually that can eventually be used by the Holy Spirit to bring them closer to Christ, because
hmm
I don't get to talk to every reader who I interact with,
Yeah.
or who reads my book, I should say. So I
Yeah.
can't directly convey my faith to them unless they contact me and have questions. And even then, if they're asking questions that aren't faith related, the first thing
hmm
I'm not going to do is say, "Oh, by the way, are you a Christian? I'm a Christian. You should be a Christian."
hmm
That's not what they're looking for. And so I don't want to throw that in people's faces, because that, again, in our society doesn't work these days. I don't know that it
hmm
ever truly worked in the first place, but it definitely doesn't work now. So it's a huge conversation, and it's a great topic that you brought up. I just err on the side of freedom for that. I think that as long as you can sleep at night, as long as you can reconcile the things that you've written with your faith, and you are willing to stand and account before God at the end of time and space and say, this is why I did this, and own up to it, then I think write whatever you
hmm
feel inclined to write, and let
Right.
the Holy Spirit take care of the rest.
And I believe that too. I've struggled with that for years. I mean, my
Yeah.
next movie that I'm writing, or it's written, but I shoot it at the end of February. It's actually a horror film.
Yeah.
And so, like, I'm not going to give too much away, but the theme of it is suffering guilt that follows you throughout your life and catches up to you and tries to condemn you, and versus forgiveness. Like, just the damage control and the guilt and shame deep down that never leaves you and tries to haunt you. Um, and just all things like that. It can be depression, it can take many different forms. We're talking
Right.
about these deeper topics. So I guess like why is there such a stigma of like Christians wanting to use with Scorsese, for example, he's a Catholic, of course, and wanting to use like using profanity or sexual content or all this mature themes and content and to tell a quote unquote Christian story.
It's because we've been taught that those things are bad in church by people who God has given authority over us, and whose authority we typically tend to respect because of their positions in our church. So your Sunday school teachers say, don't swear. Your pastor says, don't do this, don't do that. Your
hmm
your youth group leader says, don't do this, don't do this. And there's absolutely a place for them to say those things. But then when you get out into the real world, having gone to a Christian university, I can understand the concept of living in a bubble. I grew up going to church every weekend. I went to a Christian university,
hmm
and the bubble effect is a real thing. And you probably have experienced some of this as well, Jordan.
I
But
have, yes.
you're in this Christian bubble where everyone, it's all sunshine and rainbows, and everybody's singing worship songs all day, and they've got K-Love or whatever Christian radio station playing nonstop in the background to
Oh
uh,
God.
as elevator music for when you're walking to class or whatever. Then you get out into the real world and people are cussing like sailors. There's horns honking, there's mayhem, there's crime, there's all these awful things happening. The very things that in a lot of cases our pastors and our leaders at churches and our parents even have warned us, do not partake in those things. Drinking, smoking, drugs, sex, rock and roll, all of these horrible, horrible things, whatever. And
hmm
everybody's got their own
hmm
list of things that are anathema to scripture. But when you get into the real world, real people, real characters in our books do these things. So since real people do these things, our characters, if we want to tell a true and honest story, which I believe we need to
Mhm.
do because
Mhm.
the Bible tells us to tell the truth, if we are dedicated to telling the truth, then we have to tell the whole truth, not just
Mhm.
part of it. And part of that truth is the fallen nature of man. That's biblical. First book of the Bible, Adam and Eve fell from grace. They committed sin, and as a result, sin entered the world and death through sin. It's all scriptural. If we don't tell that side of the story, on some level at least, we cannot present a full picture to our audience of the
Mhm.
biblical account of Christianity, of Jesus,
Mhm.
of God's provision of a savior to counteract and effectively wipe out the sin that has befallen mankind. And so that's pretty philosophical and pretty religious and theological in nature, but that's
Mhm.
all that to say goes back to the freedom for me. Like if you want to tell a true and honest story that people will respond to, then do that. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't try and obfuscate things or cover things up. Show the ugly for what it is, and then show
Mhm.
the good for what it is too, as the contrast to that.
Yeah, and then when I was in college and like everything was so like a certain way and like it's almost like the other classmates I had,
Yeah.
it's almost like they were quote unquote sheltered and didn't know of like it's like certain normal things that you and I would say or do or see that was so foreign to some of these other students I went with, and that's just one location. I see this
Yep.
so much in like the Christian bubble as you're talking about, and it's like whether it's mental illness or just real world problems or just daily struggles, whatever it is, profanity, struggles with sex, struggles with lust, telling these stories that we know are true and that we know we all struggle with, but I get a little hesitant about because everything needs to be that Sunday morning, I'm doing all right vibe. But I guess the final question to really sum up this whole conversation and just stuff I think about all the time as a
Yep.
pastor, as a storyteller, whether it's through film with myself or books with you or when we both speak. And we think about all of our friends and families and just all the people we talk with, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, it doesn't matter. It's like, why are Christians or people in general, why are we afraid of authenticity?
I think because authenticity is tied to vulnerability.
Hmm.
If you're familiar with Brene Brown, she's big on being vulnerable, and I can't parrot back to you every point that she makes about it, but her stuff is great. Go check her out. But if you're going to be really authentic with someone, that means that you are opening yourself up to attack, and that has certainly happened.
Hmm.
On, if we're going to say that there's two sides of the aisle, I think there's more than two, but that has happened on both sides of the aisle, politically and socially, over the years. The left has felt personally attacked by the right for years and years, and even outright oppressed. And I won't get into too many specifics, but the right is absolutely guilty of it, and the left has definitely oppressed the right over the years too. Like there's no one is innocent, right? No one
Right,
is innocent,
exactly.
and so being authentic, if if you're trying to be authentic with someone, you're opening yourself up to potential harm because you're sharing the deepest hidden parts of yourself that
Hmm.
are fundamental to who you are. And if it's at your core and someone strikes you in your core, it hurts everywhere. As
Hmm.
opposed to you and I are Packer fans, right?
Oh
If
yeah.
the Packers lose, yeah, it sucks, but it's not like it's super close to my core. And
Mhm.
some Bears fan, well, the Bears never beat us. So if some Vikings fan, who we just destroyed, by the way,
Oh
some
my
Vikings fan
goodness.
is, picking on us because the Packers lost. It's like, well, okay, I don't have any control over that. Neither does Jordan, and neither do you, for that matter, Vikings fan. You didn't help the team win. You're just picking on me because your team did better. That's not a core belief. It has nothing to do with our core beliefs. The Packers, no matter how much you love a sports team, if you put your identity in them, well, that's a go see a therapist. But for most people, that's not how they wrap up their identity. If I present who I am as a person, my faith in Christ, my belief in how people should be or how life should be, if you present something that is fundamental to who you are, if you rip open your chest and say, here's my heart,
Mhm.
tread carefully, you be gentle with it, and they take it and they rip it out and throw it on the ground and step on it, it's going to hurt a lot more than someone picking on you because your sports team lost. So with authenticity comes vulnerability, and it's that vulnerability that creative people don't want to risk. But those of us who are making good artwork, regardless
Mhm.
of what the medium is, we are being authentic because we are being vulnerable. We're putting out
Mhm.
the deepest and sometimes the darkest parts of who we are, especially when you're working on horror stuff, right, Jordan? You're putting
Mhm.
out these dark parts, and people who know you're a Christian will be like, we've had this question from loved ones. People have asked me, how can you write such dark and horrible things? Aren't you a Christian?
Right, exactly.
And I've had to explain, well, yeah, but also, aren't there dark and horrible things in the world? Am I not telling the truth? So it's an ongoing conversation. I don't know that it's an intellectual battle that Christians who think like you and I anyway. I don't think it's an intellectual battle that will ever be able to win, but it also speaks to who we're targeting for our target audience. Like, are you aiming to put your stuff out in front of Christians, or are you aiming to put your stuff out in front of the general market? For me,
Mhm.
I've chosen the general market by and large. That is the audience that I'm seeking,
Yeah.
because my personal evangelism is just that. It's personal. My books are not really supposed to be a tool for evangelism. It's how I make money. It's my career. And yes, there are Christian themes in what I say, but for the most part, it's a fun artistic expression that I can share with people so that they'll enjoy it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's how I felt. And it's hard. It really is hard, I think, to express that because we still have the residual cultural effects from the 20th century that you can't do this, you can't do that. Christians don't swear. It's a lot of that legalism is still embedded into the leftovers, you could say, of culture.
Yep.
And it is hard. Just a quick side note. I had an acquaintance that went to the Packer game yesterday,
Yeah.
um, and he was saying how this one Vikings fan was like, "Well, at least we got the NFC North," as if that
Yeah.
means anything. It's just hilarious the way he talked about it. Anyway, I
Yeah.
digress.
We've won several NFC North championships, and that hasn't helped us a whole lot, has it?
No,
Not in terms of
but yeah, thank you though for uh, helping me understand that and talking to me about that.
yeah,
That is a struggle. It's like when there's like, how can like faith and art complement each other and just being honest without people think you're declining your faith or something like that. Because like, I don't know, I think that's the thing is like, I think the best gospel is one of just authenticity and vulnerability. Like, if you have a story to tell, obviously don't do it for the sake of doing it, but do it like, how is your story going to be the most impactful to the viewer or the reader? If you take certain things to show the gospel in a subconscious way, whatever, go for it. And if you're too preachy, it's going to be a big turnoff. Like they want to hear a story. They don't want to
Right,
feel like they're in church, you know?
right.
And for me, that's I struggle with that, and we all do. But
Yeah.
yeah, in my opinion, I totally agree with you. Excuse me. I should say, like, let your voice be heard,
Yeah.
express your art, and allow your faith to share that art, like let your art interpret the faith, you could say. But yeah, I guess closing remarks. Did you have any final advice for those who are authors that want to share their faith in a general sense?
Yeah, in terms of being an author, focus on being a really, really good author. Like write great stories, study
Hmm.
the craft of writing, hire a good editor, definitely hire a good cover designer. Because if your book cover sucks, no one's going to buy your book. That's just the reality of it.
Hmm.
Um, if you do the work, you will reap the rewards. That is a biblical principle, and it is absolutely true in publishing. Outside of that, just don't give up. Keep going. If this is truly your passion, if it's a talent that God has given you, chase it. Keep going. Don't stop.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for being on the Handischlapped podcast today. For those who are listening, if you want to look more up about Ben Wolf, go to www.benwolf.com. You can find all of his books. He writes from fantasy to sci-fi horror to nonfiction. He's also a public speaker that can speak for writing or youth groups or whatever. If you want to do that, he's available. He's a great guy. I've known him for years. Thank you so much, Ben, for sharing today, and you have a great day.
And you too, Jordan. Thanks for having me.
All right, man. You take care.
All right, you too. Bye.